In the summer of 1940, a former General Motors executive named William S. Knudsen received a phone call from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Knudsen had been earning one of the largest salaries in corporate America. Now Roosevelt was asking him to give it all up for a government job that paid exactly $1. Knudsen accepted without hesitation. His task was to transform American industry into what Roosevelt would soon call the great arsenal of democracy. But skeptics in Washington and across Europe said it could not be done. They said automobile factories could make Chevrolets and Buicks. They could not make bombers and tanks. 3 years later, in a factory complex in Flint, Michigan, workers at Buick were putting the finishing touches on something that would prove those skeptics catastrophically wrong. It was not a luxury sedan. It was a tank destroyer. And it was not just any tank destroyer. It was the fastest tracked armored vehicle the world had ever seen, a machine that could reach 55 miles per hour on an open road, faster than most tanks built today. The men who designed it called it a hot rod for the battlefield. The Army would call it the M18 Hellcat. The skeptics said a car company could not build a tank. Buick would prove just how wrong they were. This is the story of how American automobile workers, engineers, and executives accomplished something that military experts across the world thought impossible. It is the story of a weapon born not in an arsenal but on an assembly line. A vehicle designed not by weapon specialists but by the same people who styled luxury sedans. And it is the story of what happens when a nation's industrial might is unleashed with a single purpose. The doubts ran deep before America entered the war. When Chrysler's chief executive K.T. Keller was asked by Knudsen whether his company could manufacture tanks, Keller replied with blunt honesty. "I do not know," he said. "I do not know what a tank looks like, but show me one and I will tell you whether I can make it or not." When Ford proposed building B-24 Liberator bombers at a massive new plant called Willow Run, aviation experts dismissed the idea as fantasy. They said Ford made simple, affordable automobiles. Building bombers required precision engineering that car manufacturers simply did not possess. Buick faced its own version of this skepticism. Early in the war, the Army Ordnance Department approached Buick with a problem. They needed 75mm shell casings manufactured from steel instead of brass, which was in desperately short supply. The experts called this assignment the job that could not be done. They said the metallurgy was impossible. Steel could not be shaped into artillery casings using automotive manufacturing techniques. The precision required for ammunition was fundamentally different from what automobile factories produced. Shell casings had to withstand extreme pressures without failing. A defective casing could destroy the gun firing it and kill the crew. But Buick engineers refused to accept failure. They converted their fender stamping presses and developed new processes that no one had attempted before. By the end of the war, Buick had produced 2,424,000 steel shell casings. They delivered more than 300,000 every single month, and every one of them exceeded Army specifications. This was the character of American industry that foreign observers consistently underestimated. They saw factories that made refrigerators and sedans. They did not see the engineering talent, the production expertise, and the sheer determination that those factories contained. On December 29, 1940, President Roosevelt delivered his famous fireside chat to the American people. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared. "For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself." Roosevelt understood something that his critics did not. The same assembly lines that produced millions of automobiles could produce the weapons that would win the war. The same workers who built engines for Buicks could build engines for bombers and tanks. All they needed was direction. Roosevelt spoke directly to the American people through their radios. He explained the threat facing democracy and the role that ordinary citizens would play in defeating it. Factory workers were as important as soldiers. Production was as critical as combat. The war would be won not only on battlefields but on assembly lines. This was a message that resonated deeply with American workers who were eager to contribute to the defense of their nation. Knudsen provided that direction. He toured factories across the country, urging executives to convert their production lines to military manufacturing. When he visited Buick in Flint, He met with the division's president, a 40-year-old executive named Harlow H. Curtis. Curtis had joined General Motors as a bookkeeper in 1914. He had risen through the ranks to become Buick's president in 1933, rescuing the division from near collapse during the Depression. Now Knutson was asking him to transform Buick into something it had never been before, a weapons manufacturer. Curtis accepted the challenge. In January 1941, the Army awarded Buick a major contract for aircraft engines. The last civilian Buick rolled off the assembly line in Flint on February 3, 1942. It was a blackout model with painted trim replacing chrome, which had become a strategic material. 1 week later, not a single civilian automobile left any General Motors assembly line anywhere in the country. The conversion was total. Curtis understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. This is a war not only of men in uniform, he said, but of men in work clothes, engineers in their shirt sleeves, executives at their desks. Every machine, every drawing board, every conference table where decisions are made concerning war goods, all these are battle stations where part of the work of forging victory goes on. The transformation of Buick's Flint complex was extraordinary. Factory 1 and Factory 62 became the primary production facilities for what would become the M18 Hellcat. Building 17 housed both an aviation school and the Hellcat maintenance training school. Factory 11 produced Pratt & Whitney aircraft engines. Factory 30 manufactured aluminum engine blocks for Rolls-Royce aircraft engines, the same engines that powered the P-51 Mustang and British Spitfires. A new aluminum foundry in building 20 turned-out cylinder heads by the tens of thousands. The scale defied comprehension. Buick held approximately 30 contracts worth more than $1 billion total in 1945 money. That translates to roughly $15 billion today. Beyond the tank destroyers, Buick produced 74,797 Pratt & Whitney radial aircraft engines. They manufactured 3,120,000 aluminum cylinder heads. They made 52,200 aluminum engine blocks for Rolls-Royce aircraft engines. They built 19,428 tank powertrains, complete assemblies of engines, transmissions, and drive components, and they produced millions of shell casings and shell bodies. Not a single civilian automobile was produced between February 1942 and September 1945. The workers who had built luxury sedans were now building the weapons of war. Many of them were women who had never worked in factories before. They learned to weld, to operate machine tools, and to assemble complex mechanical systems. The transformation of the American workforce was as remarkable as the transformation of the factories themselves. The idea for the M18 Hellcat emerged from the wreckage of France. In May 1940, German panzer divisions had smashed through Allied defenses with stunning speed. The Blitzkrieg demonstrated that mass tank formations could overwhelm traditional defensive positions before reinforcements could arrive. American military planners watched this catastrophe unfold and began developing countermeasures. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall ordered the development of specialized mobile anti-tank units. On November 27, 1941, just 10 days before Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew D. Bruce took command of the Tank Destroyer Tactical and Firing Center at Fort Meade, Maryland. Bruce had a clear vision of what he wanted. He needed something faster than a tank with a better gun but less armor to allow for speed. In his own words, he wanted a cruiser rather than a battleship. Bruce's doctrine was radical. He called it Seek, Strike, Destroy. Tank destroyer battalions would be held in reserve at higher echelon headquarters. When enemy tanks attacked, these battalions would race forward at maximum speed to intercept them. They would use their mobility to maneuver around enemy flanks, strike from ambush positions, and then relocate before the enemy could respond. Speed was survival. Armor was unnecessary weight. This philosophy rejected everything the Army had learned about armored warfare. Traditional tanks were designed to absorb punishment. They carried thick armor that protected their crews from enemy fire. Bruce wanted the opposite. He wanted vehicles so fast that enemy gunners could not track them. He wanted crews who would win through maneuver rather than protection. The existing tank destroyers did not satisfy Bruce's requirements. The M10 Wolverine was too heavy and too slow. It was based on the Sherman tank chassis and carried thick armor that limited its top speed to roughly 30 miles per hour. The M36 Jackson mounted a more powerful 90mm gun but suffered from the same mobility limitations. Bruce rejected both vehicles as half measures. Only something radically different would do. The development of the M18 moved with remarkable speed. The design process began with the T-42 in December 1941, which mounted a 37mm gun. This evolved into the T-49 in April 1942, powered by two Buick Series 60 automobile engines and mounting a 57mm gun. By November 1942, the T-67 appeared with a 75mm gun and was tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Finally, in January 1943, the T-70 emerged. This was essentially a completely new vehicle with a different hull, turret, suspension, engine, and front-mounted transmission. What made this development process unusual was its origin. The basic design of the M18 did not come from Army arsenals or traditional weapons manufacturers. It came from Harley Earl's design studio at Buick. Earl was General Motors' legendary vice president of design. He was the man who would later create the Corvette and introduce tail fins to American automobiles. During the war, his styling section was renamed the Camouflage and War Service section. Earl's team produced the vehicle's exterior form, its camouflage patterns, and the iconic Hellcat logo. That logo featured a wildcat biting down on crushed tank treads flanked by the words seek, strike, destroy. The mechanical engineering, including the torsion bar suspension, powertrain integration, and hull structure, was completed by Buick's engineers. This was unprecedented. Basic military vehicle designs had always originated within the Ordnance Department. Now a car company's design studio was creating weapons of war. The first T-70 pilot model was delivered in April 1943. All 6 pilots were completed by July. Full production began immediately. On March 16, 1944, the T-70 was officially standardized as the M18. By that point, more than 1,000 had already been built. The M18 Hellcat specifications represented a deliberate philosophy of trade-offs. Every design decision sacrificed protection for speed. At roughly 18 to 20 short tons combat loaded, the M18 weighed barely half as much as the M10 Wolverine, which tipped the scales at nearly 33 short tons. It weighed just over half what a Sherman tank weighed at 33 tons. This featherweight design was the key to its extraordinary mobility. The heart of the M18 was the Continental R975 engine. This was a 9-cylinder air-cooled radial engine derived from aircraft power plants. Early production vehicles used the C1 variant rated at 350 horsepower. Later models received the supercharged C4 variant rated between 400 and 460 horsepower, depending on whether rated or peak output was measured. The engine was mounted on steel rollers, allowing maintenance crews to disconnect it, roll it out onto the lowered rear engine cover, and service it without requiring a crane. This was a revolutionary maintenance feature that dramatically reduced repair times in the field. The transmission was perhaps the most innovative component of the entire vehicle. The 900T Torquematic was a 3-speed automatic transmission with a 6-element torque converter. It was the only automatic transmission in any tank destroyer of World War II. No other country fielded anything comparable. Both the driver and assistant driver had identical duplicate driving controls, an unusual redundancy feature that allowed either crew member to operate the vehicle if the other was wounded or killed. The M18's governed top road speed was 55 miles per hour. This made it the verified fastest tracked armored fighting vehicle of the entire war. The transmission's third gear range extended to 60 miles per hour, and General Motors promotional materials claimed speeds upward of 60 miles per hour. Cruising speed in third gear was 45 miles per hour. Off-road speed was approximately 26 miles per hour. To put this in perspective, the British Cromwell, considered one of the fastest Allied tanks, could reach 40 miles per hour with its governor removed. The Soviet BT-7 managed 33 to 38 miles per hour on tracks. The German Panther topped out at 28 miles per hour. The Tiger I could reach 28 miles per hour under ideal conditions. The M18 was nearly twice as fast as any German tank. The armament consisted of a 76mm gun M1 with a barrel length of 52 calibers. This gun fired standard armor-piercing rounds at 2,598 feet per second, with penetration of 92 to 96 millimeters at 500 meters. The gun could fire approximately 20 rounds per minute. Ammunition capacity was 45 rounds, with 9 in a turret-ready rack and 18 in each hull sponson. Secondary armament was a .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun with 800 rounds. Each crew member also carried an M1 carbine and grenades. But the M18's most controversial feature was its armor, or rather its lack of armor. Maximum armor thickness was just 25.4 millimeters, roughly 1 inch on the turret front. Hull armor was a mere 12.7 millimeters, half an inch on most surfaces. The hull floor was only 4.8 millimeters thick. During testing, 9 out of 30 armor-piercing .30 caliber rifle bullets penetrated the turret side at just 75 yards. The turret top was completely open by design. This saved weight and provided superior crew visibility for ambush operations, but it left crews fatally exposed to snipers, grenades, artillery fragments, and bitter winter weather. The air-cooled engine pulled cooling air directly through the crew compartment. Crews described their vehicle as, in effect, a large armored-plated refrigerator. In the brutal winter of 1944 to 1945, this became a serious problem. Crews had to operate in temperatures well below freezing while wind whipped through the open turret. Frostbite was a constant threat. Some crews improvised canvas covers for the turret, but these interfered with the gun's operation. The thin armor created psychological challenges as well as physical ones. Tank crews in heavily armored vehicles could take some comfort from the steel surrounding them. M18 crews had no such comfort. They knew that almost any weapon on the battlefield could penetrate their vehicle. A German machine gun at close range could potentially pierce the hull. Anti-tank rifles, which were relatively ineffective against most Allied armor, posed a genuine threat to the Hellcat. Crews had to rely entirely on speed and tactics for survival. There was no margin for error. The M18 carried a crew of 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver. The turret was cramped. The gun breech was tilted 45 degrees to give the loader room to handle ammunition. Unit cost was approximately $55,230, roughly $950,000 in today's money. Buick's translation of civilian manufacturing expertise into military production was one of the M18 program's most significant achievements. The M18 was tested at the General Motors Milford Proving Ground using the same methods applied to civilian Buick automobiles. Engineers conducted top speed runs on a paved, banked oval track. They assessed ride quality on specially developed bump courses. Additional military tests included fording 6 feet of water, climbing walls, and ramming through structures. The Torquematic automatic transmission was perhaps the single most important technical innovation to emerge from the program. Developed by General Motors' Detroit Transmission Division under engineer O. Kelly, it combined a 6-element torque converter with hydraulically controlled planetary gear sets. No other tank destroyer in any army had an automatic transmission. After the war, this technology directly inspired Buick's famous Dynaflow automatic transmission, which debuted in 1948. Multiple authoritative sources confirm this lineage. The Buick Heritage Alliance states that the Dynaflow's torque converter drive had been developed as part of Buick's production during World War II of the M18 Hellcat tank destroyer. The torsion bar suspension was another innovation that Buick engineers developed to provide a stable ride at the M18's extreme speeds. This suspension type was so unusual on American vehicles that the M18 could be mistaken for a German tank, which commonly used torsion bars. The Army toured M18s around American units with oversized national markings to prevent friendly fire incidents. Manufacturing discipline was relentless. Aluminum cylinder head production, initially targeted at 25,000 per month, was ultimately tripled before construction even began. Production eventually reached 125,000 heads per month. Aircraft engine production at Buick's Melrose Park, Illinois facility, originally planned at 500 engines per month, reached 2,000 engines per month by 1944. The Tank Destroyer Board produced 16 test reports on the T-70 and recommended 137 modifications during development. Only 15 additional changes were needed once production models arrived. This was evidence of how rapidly the design matured under Buick's disciplined engineering approach. More than 157 total modifications were incorporated across the entire production run. Engineers worked around the clock to solve problems as they emerged. When early tests revealed that certain components failed under extreme stress, Buick redesigned them on the spot. The collaboration between military testers and civilian engineers was seamless. Both groups understood that lives depended on getting the design right. There was no room for bureaucratic delays or territorial disputes. The M18 program was heavily classified. A story about the new tank destroyer ran in newspapers just 1 month before production ended in October 1944. By that point, Buick had produced 2,507 machines in just over a year of full production. The M18 first saw combat in Italy in spring 1944 before it was even officially standardized. 5 T-70 prototypes went to the Anzio beachhead with the 601st and 894th Tank Destroyer Battalions. The 894th, concerned about the paper-thin armor, initially deployed them only in their reconnaissance company rather than frontline anti-tank roles. But the M18's true proving ground would come in France. General Omar Bradley initially refused the M18 when it was offered to him in January 1944. He preferred the M10 and was waiting for the M36. The first 3 M18 battalions, the 603rd, 704th, and 705th, were all assigned to General George S. Patton's Third Army. They landed at Utah Beach in mid-July 1944 and were committed to combat during Operation Cobra. The engagement that best demonstrated the M18's potential was the Battle of Ericourt in Lorraine, France. The fighting took place from September 18 through September 29, 1944. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 4th Armored Division, faced German panzer counterattacks from the 113th Panzer Brigade. On the morning of September 19, thick fog blanketed the rolling farmland of eastern France. Lieutenant Edwin Leeper led a platoon of Company CM-18s toward the village of Rechicourt-la-Petite. Visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. Leeper's M18 crept forward through the mist when suddenly a German tank gun muzzle emerged just 30 feet away. The engagement that followed lasted barely 5 minutes. Leeper's platoon destroyed 5 German tanks while losing only 1 M18. They continued firing, knocking out 10 more panzers while losing only 2 additional Hellcats. Sergeant Henry R. Hartmann achieved one of the most celebrated individual crew actions of the entire war that morning. In a single M18, Hartmann destroyed 6 German tanks, most of them Panthers. His crew exploited specific tactical advantages that the M18 provided. The fog concealed their movements. The M18's electro-hydraulic turret traversed 360 degrees in just 24 seconds, far faster than most tanks could respond. At low engine speeds, German tank turrets traversed more slowly, giving Hellcat crews precious seconds to fire multiple rounds before the enemy could bring guns to bear. Hartmann's crew developed a technique of firing between the Panther's gun mantlet and glacis plate, causing shells to ricochet into the driving compartment. Company C Commander Captain Thomas J. Evans positioned his remaining platoon on high ground, flanking a valley approach. When German tanks advanced through the valley, they were caught in devastating crossfire. The Hellcats would fire several rounds, then use their superior speed to relocate before the Germans could respond. German tank commanders found themselves engaging targets that seemed to disappear and reappear at different locations. The tactics employed at Ericourt demonstrated exactly what Andrew Bruce had envisioned when he designed the tank destroyer doctrine. The M18s did not try to slug it out with German armor. They used the terrain to their advantage, struck from positions the Germans did not expect, and vanished before effective return fire could be delivered. Speed was not just an escape mechanism. It was an offensive weapon that allowed crews to dictate the terms of every engagement. By the end of the Battle of Ericourt, the 704th had destroyed 39 German tanks while losing only 4 M18s and having 3 damaged. That was roughly a 10-to-1 kill ratio. The commander of Combat Command, a 4th Armored Division, stated bluntly that except for the 704th, the 11th Panzer could have wiped out his command. Captain Evans would receive the Distinguished Service Cross on November 22, 1944, near Moyenvic, France. During that action, he manned an armored car machine gun, drove off enemy infantry, then ran to a disabled M18 and used its gun to destroy an enemy tank. He also earned the Bronze Star with Oak Leaf Cluster during the course of the war. The Battle of the Bulge was the single moment when the M18 fulfilled its original doctrinal purpose. It was the one time American tank destroyers raced to counter a massed German armored offensive exactly as Andrew Bruce had envisioned. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Clifford D. Templeton, was attached to the 101st Airborne Division for the defense of Bastogne. At Noville, northeast of Bastogne, on December 19 and 20, 1944, just 4 M18s of the 705th supported Team d'Aubry from the 10th Armored Division and the 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment against the advancing 2nd Panzer Division. The high-speed highway run to reach the blocking position ahead of the German advance was one of the few documented cases where the M18's legendary top speed was actually used operationally in a strategic road march. The M18s raced through the Ardennes at maximum speed, arriving just in time to establish blocking positions before the German spearhead could pass. The combined American force at Noville destroyed at least 30 German tanks and inflicted between 600 and 800 casualties. The M18's ability to shoot and scoot at high speed, reappearing at different positions along the defensive line, convinced German commanders that they faced far more vehicles than were actually present. For M18s made the Germans believe they were engaging an entire tank destroyer company. This confusion stalled the German advance at a critical moment. The defense of Noville bought precious time for the 101st Airborne to establish defensive positions around Bastogne itself. When General Anthony McAuliffe issued his famous one-word reply of nuts to the German surrender demand, the M18s of the 705th were among the defenders holding the perimeter. The combination of paratroopers, armor, artillery, and tank destroyers created a defensive position the Germans could not crack. On Christmas Day 1944, 18 Panzer IVs of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, with mounted grenadiers, penetrated the 327th Glider infantry defenses around Bastogne. M18s and paratrooper bazooka teams engaged the German force and annihilated it. All 18 German tanks were destroyed in a coordinated counterattack that demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms defense. Throughout the entire Bastogne siege, the 705th destroyed approximately 40 German tanks while losing only 6 M18s. The battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for its defense of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Templeton was killed in action on March 1, 1945, just weeks before the war's end. He never saw the victory his battalion had helped make possible. The M18 also served in the Pacific Theater, where the 637th Tank Destroyer Battalion fought in the Philippines, including the Battle of Manila, and received its own Presidential Unit Citation for clearing Fort McKinley. Combat in the Pacific was fundamentally different from the armored battles of Europe. Japanese forces had few tanks capable of challenging American armor. The threat came primarily from fortified positions, concealed anti-tank guns, and suicide attacks by infantry armed with explosives. The M18's open turret, which was a calculated risk in Europe, proved more dangerous in the Pacific. Japanese soldiers armed with grenades and satchel charges targeted open-topped vehicles. Several M18 crews were killed by grenades dropped into their turrets. Despite these challenges, the vehicle proved useful for its intended purpose of mobile fire support. The 76mm gun could destroy bunkers and fortified positions that smaller weapons could not penetrate. Total Pacific theater kills were modest at 11. Reflecting the different nature of the enemy more than any deficiency in the vehicle itself. The M18 Hellcat's aggregate combat statistics present a picture of genuine tactical effectiveness. The total number of enemy vehicle kills claimed was 526. Of these, 498 occurred in the European theater, 17 in Italy, and 11 in the Pacific. Total M18 losses were 216 vehicles. This produced an overall kill-to-loss ratio of 2.4 to 1. In the European theater specifically, the ratio was 2.3 to 1. At peak strength in March 1945, 540 minutes and 18 seconds were deployed in Europe. Approximately 21 tank destroyer battalions were equipped with the M18, with 12 operating in Europe by April 1945. These numbers gave the M18 the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American tank or tank destroyer in World War II. The 76mm gun could reliably kill the common Panzer IV from any angle. Against the Panther's 80mm sloped glacis, which provided effective protection equivalent to roughly 140mm, the M18 struggled at longer ranges. The Tiger I's 100mm frontal armor was even more challenging. The Tiger II, the King Tiger, was essentially invulnerable to the M18 from the front. High-velocity, armor-piercing tungsten rounds improved penetration substantially, but these were never available in adequate quantities. Crews found that engagement ranges of 300 yards or less were necessary for reliable kills against Panthers using standard ammunition. Crews voiced both admiration and frustration with their vehicles. They praised the speed, the mechanical reliability, and the rapid turret traverse. One official assessment noted that the vehicle could go hundreds of miles under trying conditions without requiring major repairs. They praised the brilliant maintenance access that allowed engines to be swapped quickly in the field. But they also criticized the open turret's vulnerability to weather and shell fragments. They expressed concern about the thin armor that shattered crew confidence. The cumbersome turret layout slowed reloading. The machine gun position required the commander to expose himself to fire. The muzzle flash was so bright that it made the M18 a visible target in low-light conditions. Despite these criticisms, most crews preferred the M18 to other available options. The speed gave them agency over their own fate. In a heavier vehicle, they would have been trapped when the situation turned against them. In the Hellcat, they could disengage and live to fight another day. The ability to escape bad situations often outweighed the lack of protection when caught in them. During the testing phase, Buick engineers worked alongside military crews to identify and correct design flaws. The close collaboration between civilian manufacturers and military testers ensured that problems were solved rapidly before full production began. Historian Stephen J. Zaloga, author of the authoritative Osprey study on the M18, offered a more critical assessment of the design. He characterized the overall design as poorly balanced. In his view, the Hellcat's combat record is attributable to the training and dedication of its crews, not to its ill-conceived design. This assessment has merit. M18 units spent most of their time in improvised roles, providing infantry direct fire support, convoy protection, and bunker busting rather than their intended anti-tank mission. The Germans almost never employed tanks in the massed blitzkrieg formations that tank-destroyer doctrine anticipated. The Battle of the Bulge was the singular exception. The irony of the M18's service is that it excelled at a job it was never designed to do. While Andrew Bruce's Seek, Strike, Destroy doctrine envisioned roving battalions racing across the battlefield to intercept mass tank attacks, the reality of the war was very different. German armor was typically employed in small groups supporting infantry advances. The massive armored thrusts of 1940 did not recur in the West. Instead, M18 units found themselves pressed into service as mobile artillery, their 76mm guns providing accurate direct fire against fortified positions. In this role, the M18's speed was less important than its gun's accuracy and rate of fire. But the vehicle still served effectively. Its low profile made it difficult to spot. Its quick acceleration allowed it to dart from cover to fire and return before enemy gunners could respond. The automatic transmission that Buick had developed made these maneuvers possible even for relatively inexperienced drivers. Among American tank destroyers, the M18 occupied a unique position. It carried less firepower and armor than the M36 Jackson, but was vastly faster and more agile than either the M10 or M36, both of which were based on the Sherman chassis. Against German equivalents, the contrast in design philosophy was stark. The Sturmgeschütz 3 assault gun, Germany's most produced armored fighting vehicle with more than 10,000 built, represented the opposite approach. It featured a low-profile, reasonable armor of 50 to 80 millimeters, and a casemate design with no turret that required the entire vehicle to turn for lateral targeting. Maximum speed was just 25 miles per hour. The Jag Panther is considered by many experts to be the finest tank destroyer of the war. It mounted a devastating 88mm PaK-43 gun behind 80mm of sloped frontal armor, but only 415 were ever built and reliability was poor. The Jagdpanzer IV offered 60 to 80mm of frontal armor and effective firepower, but was nose-heavy and slow at 24 miles per hour. The closest German conceptual equivalent to the M18 was the improvised Martyr series, also open-topped and lightly armored. But these were stopgap designs with far inferior mobility. The M18's speed advantage was not merely incremental. It was transformative. Historian Bill Gross observed that the Hellcat was considered the hot rod of World War II. To give perspective, most German tanks of the day were capable of just 20 miles per hour, and even today's M1 Abrams tank is outpaced by the Hellcat. A post-war Army study concluded that raw top speed was largely unimportant in tactical combat. What mattered was acceleration, agility, and the ability to quickly change position, all qualities the M18 possessed in abundance. The top speed proved strategically valuable exactly once in the desperate race to reach Bastogne before the German spearhead could close the trap. The M18's post-war life proved remarkably long. The United States retired it immediately after the war, converting 640 early M18s to M39 armored utility vehicles. These turretless cargo and personnel carriers served in Korea. But through military aid programs, the M18 reached dozens of nations. Yugoslavia became the largest foreign operator with between 240 and 260 vehicles. They designated it the So-76 Hellcat and used them through the Yugoslav wars of 1991 to 1995, half a century after production ended. The vehicle's speed and reliability made it useful long after more modern vehicles had been introduced. Spare parts were scavenged from multiple vehicles to keep operational machines running. One M18 was mounted on an armored train called the Kraina Express, a bizarre improvisation that would have astonished the Buick engineers who designed the original vehicle. During the 1999 Kosovo War, inoperable M18 Hulks served as decoys to attract NATO airstrikes. Even in retirement, the Hellcat was still serving a military purpose. Taiwan acquired approximately 200 to 240 vehicles according to various sources. Engineers later combined M18 turrets with M42 Duster hulls to create the Type 64 light tank. Greece received 127 complete M18s, and when the vehicles were eventually retired, their turrets were repurposed as fixed gun emplacements on the northern borders. Other operators included Italy, Iran, the Philippines, and Venezuela. Total Buick wartime production exceeded $1 billion in 1945 money. After the war, Harlow Curtis stayed at Buick to see Buicks rolling again off the assembly line before accepting promotion. He eventually became General Motors president from 1953 to 1958 and was named Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1955. His leadership during the war had demonstrated executive talents that would shape General Motors for decades. The Torque-O-Matic transmission begot the Dynaflow. The technology developed for a tank destroyer became the foundation for one of the most popular automotive features of the 1950s. American drivers who had never heard of the M18 Hellcat were driving cars with transmissions descended directly from it. The M18's torsion bar suspension influenced modern military vehicle design. The principles Buick engineers developed to achieve stability at high speeds remain relevant in contemporary armored vehicle development. Bill Gross, who restored an M18 at the Sloan Museum in Flint, reflected on the legacy. The men and women who developed the Hellcat and assembled them on the Buick line in Flint contributed a great deal to the war effort and to military engineering history. These people were instrumental in bringing such a great conflict to a close, and their innovations are still in use today. Buick City continued as Buick's primary manufacturing complex until 1999, when it was closed. The buildings were demolished between 2000 and 2012. The workers who built tank destroyers during the war returned to building automobiles. Most never spoke much about what they had accomplished. The M18 Hellcat story resists simple narratives of triumph. It was simultaneously the most effective American tank destroyer by kill ratio and a vehicle whose underlying doctrine was largely irrelevant to how the war was actually fought. Its thin armor terrified its own crews even as its speed saved their lives. It was designed for massed panzer counterattacks that almost never materialized except at the Bulge, where it proved indispensable. The lesson of what Buick accomplished should not be forgotten. The skeptics who said automobile manufacturers could not build sophisticated military hardware were measuring American potential by American performance in peacetime. They saw factories making sedans and concluded those factories could not make weapons. They saw assembly lines designed for consumer goods and assumed those lines could not adapt. They judged American capability by what existed, not by what could be created when necessity demanded it. They were wrong about everything. The transformation happened because ordinary Americans did extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The engineers who adapted fender presses to make shell casings had never imagined themselves in the weapons business. The workers who assembled tank destroyers had spent their careers building family cars. The executives who managed this conversion had no military experience whatsoever. They did these things anyway. They learned skills they had never possessed. They achieved feats that experts said were impossible. And when the war was over, they went back to making automobiles and rarely discussed what they had done. The M18 Hellcat stands as a testament to what American industry could accomplish when fully mobilized. In just over a year, a car company that had never built a military vehicle produced more than 2,500 of the fastest tank destroyers the world had ever seen. Those vehicles went on to achieve the highest kill ratio of any American armored vehicle in the war. The factories that built them have been demolished. The workers who assembled them have passed into history. The war they helped win ended 8 decades ago. But the story matters because it demonstrates what is possible when civilian expertise is applied to military challenges. The men and women of Buick did not possess specialized military knowledge. What they possessed was engineering talent, manufacturing discipline, and the determination to succeed at a task everyone said could not be done. History does not repeat, but it echoes. Nations still underestimate what their adversaries can accomplish. Leaders still confuse assumptions with reality. The skeptics who dismissed American industrial capacity in 1940 were not foolish men. They were capable professionals who let preconceptions override evidence. They saw an America they expected to see and ignored the America that actually existed. The M18 Hellcat was born from that America, built by autoworkers in Flint, Michigan, designed in a styling studio that normally created luxury sedans, powered by technology that would later drive civilian automobiles down American highways. It was not a perfect weapon, but it was exactly what American industry could produce when asked to build a cruiser rather than a battleship. The crews who fought in M18s understood its limitations. They knew their half-inch armor would not stop much of anything. They knew the open turret left them exposed to the elements and enemy fire, but they also knew they could outrun anything on the battlefield. They knew their gun could kill German tanks if they got close enough, and they knew that speed, properly applied, was worth more than armor. At Ericourt, for M18s helped stop an entire panzer brigade. At Bastogne, a handful of Hellcats convinced the Germans they faced a far larger force. These were not accidents. They were the result of good training, sound tactics, and a vehicle that, for all its flaws, gave its crews the tools they needed. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these histories that deserve to be remembered. Each one matters. Each one tells us something about what ordinary people can accomplish in extraordinary circumstances. We would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive. The history you just heard carries lessons that echo into our present day. The same ingenuity that built the M18 Hellcat in Flint, Michigan, still exists in factories and workshops across America. The same determination that drove Buick's engineers to solve problems experts called impossible still drives innovators today. What Harlow Curtis and his workers accomplished was not a miracle. It was the application of skill, discipline, and will to an urgent problem. That capacity does not disappear when wars end. It waits for the next challenge. The M18 Hellcat was proof that a car company could build a tank and build it better than anyone expected. The skeptics were wrong then,